it's ironic. I live in the United States, a country that guarantees in its Constitution the freedom of speech. And yet, as a speaker, I am constantly cautioned, warned, and threatened to not speak about three topics: sex, politics, and religion. It is so refreshing to actually be at a symposium that not only permits it, but encourages it. Wouldn't the world be a better place if we all discussed sex, politics, religion, and all manner of controversial topics freely, openly, and honestly? How important is the ability to speak? I can answer that question with one photograph. You see two good men. And I don't know about the rest of you from the U.S., but I know that I certainly was pleased for the first time in so many years to actually have a choice of two good candidates. And yet you see that we have two good men, but one was competent, the other was eloquent. One spoke of experience, the other spoke of vision. Was it the deciding factor? No, but it certainly was a deciding factor. The ability to speak is something that each one of us has, yet not everyone exercises. Talking is a skill. Speaking is an art. And it is an art that each one of you can use. Let's just see a show of hands right now. I have 19 minutes remaining. If I were to say I need someone besides one of the speakers, I would like for someone to come up and take the next 19 minutes. Let's see, who would do it? Anyone? No one? One over there? Well, congratulations to you. You're not going to get the chance. But I appreciate you willing to do it. You see, most people are not eager to get up in front of an audience and speak. And in the next 19 minutes, I'm going to give you something that will hopefully allow you, the very next time that question is asked, to raise your hand. In fact, in the next 19 minutes, I'm going to give you 6 words that can change the way that you speak. They did for me, and I am sure they will for you. But before I get into that topic, let me continue on the relationship between politics and speaking. You will notice that on the screen is an article that's published in the New York Times. And you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, it's written by a man named David Brooks. You should know that is not me. Even though, if you notice in the photo panel, there is a physical resemblance. I say that for this lady who was offended that her husband was going to be on the program with that David Brooks. Actually, I've been getting a lot of interesting emails recently because that David Brooks is a conservative-leaning columnist who said some very flattering things about Obama. And as a result, the hardcore conservatives have come out in droves to criticize him, mostly by sending me nasty emails. Just yesterday, as I landed, I checked my email on the BlackBerry from the runway at the airport, and there was an email that said, "You are scum." And I'm thinking, I wonder where this is going. And then I'm thinking, well, surely she's talking about him. And she continued to berate him via me for several paragraphs. A few weeks ago, I got an email from another woman who took me to task for something that he wrote. And I wrote her back, and politely, this was one of the first times this mistake had happened, I wrote back politely and said, "You have the wrong guy." In fact, I've even registered the domain theotherdavidbrooks.com. And she wrote back about an hour later and said, I'm sorry, now that we've established that I'm an idiot. Then she said, what did you think about my original opinion? It just shows you that sometimes people are eager to make a complaint, or they're eager to criticize when they really don't have grounds to do so. And isn't it time that in the nature of political discourse that we return to an era of civility and courtesy and politeness? I am this David Brooks. I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, I'm an author, and I'm the 1990 world champion of public speaking. And I don't say that to try to impress you. I just simply tell you that I started off just being as inept of a speaker, as frightened of a speaker as anyone. But I learned something that I'm about to share with you that will help you to attain the same kind of skills that I did. You can find me at davidbrookstexas.com. I invite you to visit my website because I have a lot of free resources up there for you. As Edward said, free, no charge. Be glad to give it to you. Visit the website and check out all of the free resources because I want to be known as one of the greatest teachers of speakers ever. And so I give you that information for free under the Resources tab. Explore the site. There's also a section called a blogazine that I encourage you to sign up for if you wish. It's free. But I want you to be a better speaker as a result of what you have learned in this presentation today. And so I'm about to share with you these 6 words that can change the way you speak. They did for me and they will for you. I will tell you who I heard them from. I don't think they were originally his, but I heard them in 1992 from a man named Bill Gove. And he stood at a Toastmasters convention and he said, public speaking is simply this: make a point, tell a story. He said, that's public speaking. He said, don't make it harder than that. He said, that is public speaking. Make a point, tell a story. Make another point, tell another story. Make yet another point, tell yet another story. He said years after he will have given a speech somewhere, somebody will see him at an airport or a hotel. They'll come up and say, Bill, I still remember your story about, and they'll tell him his story. He said he'll always be flattered. He'll smile. He'll laugh. He'll say, that's great. By any chance, do you remember the point? And they say, no, but I got the story. He said he'll laugh with them again and said, but if you got the story, you got the point. Well, I'm about to save you 4 years of learning if you're thinking like I was. Because when I heard him say that, I thought he was talking about the big, monumental, awe-inspiring, life-changing story. I thought he was talking about the kind of story you would have if you've climbed Mount Everest. Let's see a show of hands. Have any of you got that as one of your stories? Anyone? No? Well, let's pause for just a moment and I'll tell you a story. I was in Seattle doing this presentation, and I said at this point in the presentation, if you've climbed Mount Everest, you've got a story. Do any of you have that story? And one hand went up. And I thought he didn't understand the question. So I was trying to let him off the hook easy. I said, no, I'm asking, have you climbed Mount Everest? And he said, yes, I have. And that day I realized that in any room, in this room, there will be some of you who have done things that are monumental, that are awe-inspiring, that are worthy of respect and admiration. But most of us have not. I had not. And so when I heard that, I thought, I've got to go out and do something big in order to be a speaker. Well, I wandered around for 4 years trying to think, what could I do that would be monumental, that would allow me to be a speaker? I couldn't find a thing. Then 4 years later, I was reading the morning newspaper, and in a small column of trivia, there was a single entry that jumped off the page. It said, every human being alive experiences these 6 emotions. They are happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, disgust, and fear. Now, is this scientifically proven? Not to my knowledge, but I have never seen it refuted. But when I read those 6 emotions, I thought of Bill Gove's 6 words, make a point, tell a story, and I brought those 2 thoughts together. And that was the moment that I stopped giving speeches and I started telling stories. What kind of stories? The little stories that happened to you and happened to me that trigger one of these 6 emotions. In fact, I'll give you a challenge. I want you to think to a moment. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to think of a moment in your life that is so crystal clear in your memory that you can recall every sight, sound, smell, every sensation of the moment. A moment that is so crystal clear that as you recall it, you feel it. I'll give you 15 seconds. Now, how many of you have a moment in mind? Show of hands. How many of you have a moment? Good. Does the moment that you're thinking of trigger at least one of these 6 emotions? At least one of the 6, maybe more? If you were to tell that story, would it make the listener feel the same emotion? Yes, it would. Because what makes you happy will make others happy unless you're very strange. What makes you sad will make others sad unless you're even stranger. What makes you angry will make others angry. So if you tell the stories that triggered these emotions, you can form an emotional connection with listeners anywhere, everywhere, every time. What kind of stories? Well, I'll share with you several examples. 4 quick examples from my personal story file to illustrate how this works. I have a 14-year-old son named Matthew. When he was 4, he had learned how to spell his name as a result of playing computer games because they required him to log in. And so every day he asked for me to do it for him, and every day I did. And then one day I said, no, you're old enough. If you want to play the game, you have to spell your name. So I forced him to learn to spell his name on a computer keyboard. A few days later, he was away from the computer. I thought I'd test him. I said, spell your name. He said, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, enter. Let's set that story aside for a moment. Let's jump ahead to October of 2001, 1 month after 9/11. My wife, my son, and I were traveling through the airport in Hilo, Hawaii. As we went through the X-ray screening gates, one of the screeners looked at me and looked at my son, who was then 7. And he said, sir, do you mind if I search your son for weapons? I said, if you think he fits the profile of a terrorist, go ahead. And sadly, he did. Sad for a number of reasons, I can tell. What emotions are in that story? Is there happiness? No. Is there sadness? Yes. Is there anger? Yes. Is there surprise? Yes. Is there disgust? Yes. And is there fear? Yes. There's 5 of the 6 emotions in that one little vignette. Let's go back to the Matthew Enter story. In that story, what emotions were triggered? Happiness, and surprise. Do you realize that those 2 stories take 45 seconds apiece to tell? I know, I've written them, I've timed them. 45 seconds apiece to tell. I told them back to back for a reason, because I wanted to show you that in 90 seconds I could take you on a roller coaster ride of all shared human emotions. I can take you up and I can take you back down and back up again all day long with nothing more than the little vignettes, the little slices of life that happen to me just like they happen to you. Now, I promise God is not up there saying, Dave will get the stories and no one else. The stories are happening to you at the same rate they're happening to me. The difference is I write mine down and I use mine, and I encourage you to start doing the same. I want you to be a collector of your own personal stories. And the key is your stories. I'll tell you another story about Matthew. When he was in kindergarten, he came home one day and he said, there's a new boy in class. He's from Japan. I don't understand him. He speaks Japanese. But he laughs in English. Happiness and surprise. The next time that you hear someone laugh, are you going to say, what language? That's how these stories work. I'll share one more story from my files, and then I'll do a little recap of what you might remember from this morning. This tie that I'm wearing is actually one that I'm rather proud of to wear when I speak, because I got it of all places, and I know you're going to think this is a pun, but it's not. I got it in Thailand. I was in Bangkok speaking at a conference, and there was a man wearing a tie, and I'm going to have to say, very much like this. I complimented him. I said, "Lovely tie." He said, "Oh, you like the tie?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Here." And he took it off, and he handed it to me. And I said, "No, I'm not asking for your tie." And he said, "No, you honored me with your words. You will honor me more by wearing my tie." So I said, "What kind of a car do you drive?" Imagine how honored he would be. Well, let's see what you remember from this morning. Those were a few little stories to illustrate how this works. And they're simple, and they're easy, and they're real. And you have them too. Let's go through a few. And the reason that stories work is because facts tell, stories sell. And I don't mean selling a product. I mean selling yourself, selling your ideas, selling your point. Let's see if you remember from this morning, Gerd's presentation. He talked about a gut feeling, and he talked about the gut feeling at the airport. You remember that story? How many of you have already forgotten? Anybody? No, you remember that gut feeling that the policeman had as he was searching for the supposed drug runner. And using Dan's criterion, it was easily understood, it was easily remembered, and it will change something. It will change the way you behave the next time you go through the screening gates at the airport. From Edward's presentation, he asked us to close our eyes and imagine the bed that we would be sleeping in 5 years from now. And he said, you can't do it, right? Well, let's see if we can modify that. Close your eyes and imagine the bed you'll be sleeping in 5 years from now. And then imagine with whom you are sharing that bed. Now that's concrete. And that one you can imagine, or at least fantasize. He also mentioned that monkeys were capable of changing their minds. And at that point, I had a flashback to the last 8 years in American politics. Was I the only one that thought that? Oh, sure, right. David Barash used a term that I was not familiar with. He talked about redirected aggression. And I didn't know that term. But I won't forget the two examples. Do you remember what they were? One was the horses, and second was Geronimo. The horse's story was his, Geronimo's story was not, but I'll remember them both. And if you were here this morning, I bet you will too. You see, these are ideas that will stick. Dan Gilbert talked about Armani socks, heroin, and baseball. And he said, Armani socks cost how much? $200 a pair. And when I heard him say that, I'm thinking, who would pay $200 for socks? And then when I heard Jody Williams, I said, oh, it's the people who care how many babies Angelina Jolie adopts. That's who buys Armani socks. And as a baseball fan, he said one thing that I have to admit I disagree with. He said that there was nothing more tedious than a no-hitter. He said it was hours of tedium punctuated by one transcendental moment. And at the time I thought, well, I would enjoy watching a no-hitter. I did get to see one time, and I enjoyed it. But when I thought, well, what's a better example of hours of tedium punctuated by one transcendental moment? And I thought, Disneyland. Yeah, been there, done that, right? Well, those are ideas that will stick. Those are ideas that will stay with you because they were stories. Whose stories? The speaker's stories. Do you have stories as good? Absolutely you do. I promise you that each person in here has a story. Each one of you has a story. Everyone has a story. And somebody needs to hear it. Everybody has a story, and somebody needs to hear it. But who is going to tell that story if not you? I asked at the beginning of this presentation, how important is the ability to speak? Daniel Webster famously said, "If all my possessions were taken from me with one exception, I would choose to keep the power of speech, for by it I would soon regain the rest." It's been a privilege to share these words with you.